Yeah. Although they might go crazy then, hey?
It'll probably come as no surprise to you that the United States military operates some of the most expensive aircraft in the history of this planet. But how much do these platforms really cost to fly? And what exactly goes into these figures that we see bandied about in headlines so often? Let's talk about how much it really costs to fly America's tactical and strategic aircraft, starting on the cheaper end with the A-10 Warthog and the F-16 Fighting Falcon, both of which ring in at around $22,000 per hour to fly. Up next is the F-35, which is certainly more expensive but has gotten significantly cheaper in recent years. F-35 operations used to cost north of $45,000 or even $50,000 per hour, but in recent years it's been cut down to around $33,000 per hour. The F-22 Raptor, on the other hand, comes in at a jaw-dropping $85,000 per hour, by far the most expensive fighter to operate in the U.S. arsenal. From there, we'll move to bombers like the B-52, which, despite its massive size and the most recent B-52 being delivered in the 1960s, still rings in at only a bit more than a Raptor at about $88,000 per hour to fly. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber comes in at around $150,000 per hour, and the B-1B Lancer, America's heavy payload swing-wing supersonic bomber, costs more than any of them at $173,000 per hour to fly. But what do these figures even mean? Because that obviously represents a whole lot more than just the cost of filling their fuel tanks. And there are a lot of variables that can result in widely different figures. The first and most important to consider is timetable. The US Air Force tends to calculate operating costs by year. In other words, the total cost expended on a platform over the number of hours those jets flew in a given year gives you its operating cost. But other agencies, organizations, or branches may calculate operating cost over a platform's lifetime, which would give you a wildly different number. The F-35, as one example, costs a whole lot less today to operate than it did just 3 years ago. So if you're averaging 3 years worth of operating costs, you'll get a very different figure than averaging 1 year's. But as far as variables go, that's just the beginning, because these cost per flight hour figures actually include accrued costs from 7 different categories of spending, some of which are pretty far removed from actually flying the airplane. The first and most direct cost is, of course, fuel expended. But again, it's important to understand that we are talking about a platform average here. If we continue using the F-35 as our example, it carries a bit more than 18,000 pounds of fuel on board. And under military power, flying at cruising speed of a bit better than 680 miles per hour, that's enough to stay airborne for 2.5 hours. But if you're under afterburner, an F-35 could expend every drop of fuel in that tank in a matter of minutes. So obviously, fuel costs need to be an average. But of course, fuel is just the beginning. The second operating cost category is similarly direct, and it's repair and maintenance. Now that's just good old-fashioned inspecting the aircraft after every flight and replacing or repairing any components that wear out or break. And that's probably where you figured these numbers end, but there's a whole lot more that gets rolled into this cost per flight hour figure, like the cost of personnel. Now that's not just the salary and benefits for the pilot, but also the pay and benefits for the maintainers and ordnance technicians and everyone else that plays a role in maintaining these aircraft for day-to-day flight operations. And if we're going to talk about personnel, we'd better talk about training. Not only does the cost per flight hour figure reflect the cost of training pilots, but also training those maintainers and technicians, all the support personnel involved in flying these jets every day. And that's not just initial training, but also a great deal of follow-on training out in the fleet and the force at large, because as new systems are rolled out, you need to train on how to repair and maintain them, not to mention consistent training to make sure that your previous skills don't atrophy. But it doesn't matter if you've got the best trained personnel in the world if they don't have the tools to do their job. And that's why operating cost category number 5 is support equipment. Now, this includes all of the specialized tools and equipment that you need to repair or maintain these aircraft, and sometimes may include procurement cost of new equipment, while other times it may include the depreciation value of the continued use of equipment that you already have. And when systems can be used across platforms, that cost gets split between those aircraft based on the amount of time that they're used by each aircraft. And if we're going to talk about equipment, then we've got to talk about operating cost category number 6, which is logistics and supply chain. Because you don't just need to buy the aircraft and train all the personnel and make sure they have the right tools, you also need a steady supply of replacement parts, ordnance, and other things that just wear out in day-to-day operations. And because of that, you need to not just buy this stuff, but you need to be able to transport it all around the world exactly as needed. And that comes with a great deal of database management and server space and things like that, all of which get rolled right up into that cost per flight hour. And even after you've bought your aircraft and trained your personnel and got them the right tools for the job and set up your supply lines, now you still have to deal with overhead, which is operating cost category number 7, infrastructure and administrative cost. Not only do you need to pay for administrators' time as they're making sure the pay and benefits and awards are right for all those pilots and maintainers, you've got to pay for the hangar that you store the aircraft in. You need warehouse space to store all those spare parts and munitions. You need database clerks to track where the parts are and when they're used. You need lots of infrastructure. And all of those costs, from storing the ladder pilots use to get into and out of the aircraft to painting the lines on the flight line, all get rolled into this overall operating cost per hour figure. And ultimately, from the cockpit to the flight line, these jobs are all really important to making sure that day-to-day operations not just continue, but continue safely and at a high degree of readiness. In other words, these numbers are not calculated to equip people to win arguments about whether or not the F-35 is better than the Gripen E, or whether or not the F-16 is better than the A-10, because those comparisons are ultimately academic. The real reason these numbers are calculated is for effective mission planning. Military planners use these figures to make sure that they've got the budget room and resources that are necessary to properly train, equip, and operate these air power units all around the world. Because without effective planning, all of this would be for naught. And while these figures really do encompass a whole lot more than just filling up the gas tank and sending a fighter down the runway, at the end of the day, the real intent is not that different. It's just about mission readiness, and mission readiness wins fights.